I don't need the coach. Maybe I do, but I'm not planning to use it. Okay. Okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry for the delay, everybody. So welcome to the afternoon discourse session, which I just understood I'm chairing. Okay, so sorry, this is sort of discombobulated. Yes. Oh, you know, if you're on Zoom. How's that? Better? Can you guys turn off the echo back there? If anybody's on Zoom, maybe mute it. How about now? Okay, okay, great. Okay. So just a warning, I was not going to present this talk. My collaborator, Savi Nambudidiripad, was going to present it. She's the first author, but she couldn't be here. So I'm presenting it in her stead, and I created these slides in the last few days. But the second co-author, Nicole Cuneo, is also here, and we worked with another group of students at Michigan. So Matthew Kramer, Jordanis Sordaros, Yushi Sugimoto, Felicia Bismath, and I'm the last author. All right, so just to give you an introduction, I want to explain the basic idea that creativity stems from combining constructions. So if I say a sentence like, today in linguists are not kidding when they say that language enables you to understand sentences that have never been said before in the entirety of human history, it sounds somewhat novel. But in the middle of that is a sentence that probably many of you have heard many times before, which is, language enables you to understand sentences you've never said before. That's almost a cliche among linguists. So there's also contained in that little excerpt another collocation, which is today in some news topic, and that's combined with other collocations. We also have another collocation where we say people are not kidding when they say some content. And finally, in the entirety of some time period is also a collocation. So when we hear a sentence like the one I read before, today in linguists are not kidding when they say that language enables you to understand sentences that have never been said before in the entirety of human history, what you're doing clearly is combining multiple collocations or constructions. So more generally, every construction, including grammatical constructions, has a particular function. And the claim in this paper is that it's infelicitous to combine constructions with incompatible discourse functions. So I'm going to be trying to explain a rather archaic set of facts if you're not a linguist. But if you are a linguist, these might be familiar to you. So I'm going to start by just giving an example that does not come from. I'll give you an example. Okay, so compare these two sentences. The woman who lived upstairs ordered a computer versus the woman who ordered a computer lived upstairs. They convey the same content, but what's asserted versus what's backgrounded or taken for granted differs. So the part that's at issue is the main clause, and these relative clauses are less important. Okay. So what I'm going to focus on today is the combination of what are called long distance dependencies, and I'll explain those, with other constructions, in particular adjuncts. So long distance dependencies are examples where there's a long distance in terms of the string, semantic dependency between one word and another word. So if I give you a simple sentence like Keisha ordered a computer after getting the job, and I want to ask about a computer, I'm likely to use a long distance dependency construction like this WH question construction. What did she order after getting the job? And you see that there's a semantic dependency between where the computer usually is after order and where it actually is in the question. And if you're wondering, what's long distance about that, notice that in other sentences, the distance between the WH word and the gap in the sentence, or where the where the word normally occurs can be longer. So if I say, he said she ordered a computer after getting the job, and I again want to ask about the computer, I can say, what did he say she ordered after getting the job? And that's fine. So long distance, there are various types of long distance dependency constructions. We're going to be focusing on a particular example, that of WH questions. But just to keep in mind, there are other kinds like topicalization constructions where the computer he broke or the computer she said he broke and so on. Okay, now what we're going to be looking at is the combination of long distance dependency constructions with another type of construction, which are called adjuncts. Now, adjuncts are kind of hard to define, something of a grab bag. There are many different types of adjuncts, but if you had to define them, you would probably say that they are phrases in a sentence that tend to be optional. You don't have to include them. And they're also described as less central or more peripheral to some core event. So for example, she ordered a computer is a core event. And Keisha drove to New York. It also describes a core event. But either of these two sentences can include optional adjuncts. So you can add after getting the job, or in the second sentence, a combination of multiple adjuncts. Now, the puzzle that we're going to try to address is the fact that if you utter a sentence where there's that has an adjunct, like she ordered a computer after getting the job. So after getting the job is optional, it's less important to the main event, and you want to ask about the job, you can do that mechanically by saying, what did she order a computer after getting? But you may notice that that sounds a little odd. And what we're going to be doing is measuring just how odd it sounds to people and looking for an explanation as to why it sounds odd. So this oddness exists to some degree with all of these kinds of adjuncts where we have a preposition and then an untensed verb. They're even worse when the verbs are tensed. But I won't read them out loud because they tend to be annoying to hear since they sound odd. So I'm going to address one kind of explanation, but I want to mention that there are two types of explanations that have been very popular. Or the traditional view is that there's some kind of syntactic explanation, that there's something about the way the trees are drawn that disallows a long distance dependency from between a WH word and something within an adjunct. And so in this particular case, you could think of it as the WH word can't have two verbs in between. That might be one way to think about it. I'm not going to get into the syntactic explanation, but this is a portrayal. It's a rigid explanation in terms of trees. The alternative explanation is the one we're going to focus on more, and to describe it, to just say it right now, is the idea that backgrounded constructions are islands, and I'll explain that in detail as we go. But the idea is that functions of the constructions have to be compatible to be combined. So notice that any kind of syntactic approach would presumably say that you shouldn't expect systematic gradients or variation in judgments among these different types of adjuncts, because presumably they all have the same tree. Whereas the idea that backgrounded constructions are islands does predict variation insofar as backgroundedness differs between different adjuncts. So the argument is that grammatical constructions have functions. Certain constructions are designed to express information that's backgrounded in the discourse or less at issue, less asserted, more presupposed. There are various terms you could use. I favor backgroundedness, but I'm hoping, well, you don't need to just get the general idea. We're going to operationalize it in a moment. WH questions clearly ensure that one particular argument, the WH word, is at issue in the discourse, right? It's the whole reason for asking the question is what, where, who, and so on. So the idea is that it's infelicitous to make an argument both backgrounded and at issue. That is, it's infelicitous for the speaker to say, I want to ask about this, and I'm going to formulate it in such a way that the thing I want to know about is referred to in some backgrounded construction. That's infelicitous. So the intuition then is that what makes the sentence, what did Keisha order a computer after getting? Again, I know that makes your head spin probably. What makes that a little odd though is that the WH word is at issue, it's prominent in the discourse, it is a focus in this case, while the adjunct is backgrounded in discourse. So what do we mean by backgrounded? These terms that have to do with information structure are notoriously slippery. So we're going to operationalize it, and we're going to operationalize it in 3 different ways. So one idea was loosely inspired by a paper by Truswell, and the idea being that only elements of a single event are available for WH questions. And then we're going to use a negation test, and that idea will be that backgrounded constructions are less impacted by main clause negation. And then finally, we're going to look at a new measure that Nicole Cuneo presented in a poster yesterday, which is that backgrounded constructions provide requested information only indirectly. Okay, so in the first experiment, we used a combination of adjuncts as stimuli. They included adjuncts that started with 2, so the mechanic changed classes to meet the engineer, and adjuncts that included before or after clauses. So the mechanic changed classes after meeting the engineer, for example. There were 4 different lists to vary the order, and we included 8 fillers. So we chose those particular adjuncts because we wanted to include this operationalized test of the single event. And that was that if something's a single event, then you might expect it should involve temporal overlap. And of course, the after and before include less, are temporally overlap less than the 2 clauses. So the task went like this. The mechanic changed classes to meet the engineer. That is, an example stimulus was presented to people. And then the 2 sub-events were mentioned. So changing classes and meeting the engineer. And people had to decide how likely is it that these 2 events occur at the same time. And if people said very likely, then we took that to mean that it was at issue or asserted. And to the extent that they said it was very unlikely that they occurred at the same time, we interpreted that as backgroundedness on this measure of backgroundedness. And what we see, what you're looking at here is the acceptability ratings on the y-axis and the degree of backgroundedness, where more backgrounded is to your left. And we pre-registered a model comparison with random effects to see if the interaction added value to the model. And it did. So what you're looking at is in red, the declarative sentences. We don't expect backgroundedness to affect declaratives. And it doesn't. So you can see the red line is straight across. But there is a correlation with acceptability on the WH questions and this completely separate test of whether the events co-occur at the same time. So there is a correlation, it's significant, but we also tested the negation task on the same set of stimuli. And in this case, the question was, we encouraged people to think about what the sentence means, and we negated the main clause. So we said the mechanic didn't change classes to meet the engineer. Now, when you negate something, if it's part of what's asserted, if it's in the focus domain, if you will, it should be negated. But if it's backgrounded, it tends not to be negated. So if people decide that the adjunct is negated, so that when you say the mechanic didn't change classes to meet the engineer, that implies that if it implies that the mechanic did not meet the engineer, that would mean that the adjunct had been asserted because it's under the scope of negation. It's negated by the main clause negation. And to the extent that people said, yes, he still did, doesn't matter that the main clause was negated, this backgrounded construction is independent of negation, then it means that the adjunct is more backgrounded. So we had 96 participants on this, and I'll show you this data. So it looks like it did before, but the only difference is that the measure of backgroundedness was different. And now we see a stronger effect. Now, when we looked at this data more carefully, we noticed that we created the stimuli involving two general types of adjuncts. They were to do something verbs or before or after doing something verbs. And we had assumed that they had generally the same syntax, the same tree. You could imagine, you have a preposition and then an untense verb, but you might want to argue that that there's a difference in syntax between infinitives and gerunds. And in fact, when you look at the data, it's clear that the difference is between those two categories. So the before and after adjuncts were very strongly backgrounded, and all of the variation came from the two adjuncts. So we did a second experiment where we included all V-ing adjuncts. Now, this is a strong test because notice here, they don't vary much. And one way to interpret this is to say, one possibility is that all V-ing adjuncts are very strongly backgrounded. And so you really cannot ask questions from them. But we persisted, and we included a set of by V-ing adjuncts and while V-ing adjuncts. And this time we dropped the temporal task and we only did the negation task. So we had participants rate the declarative sentences, and a different group rate the questions. The questions were things like this. So what did the woman try meditation while imagining versus what did the woman try meditation by imagining? No participants got both of these. They were counterbalanced across lists. We included 48 fillers that were the same for the declaratives and questions. And the sentences were all provided using audio stimuli. Okay, so again, the negation task looks like this. And we would simply say, think about what this sentence means. The woman didn't try meditation while imagining the beach. Did the woman imagine the beach? You can reflect yourself. She didn't try meditation while imagining the beach. Did she imagine the beach? I mean, we don't know for sure, but people, they gave us gradient ratings. They could have said no, or they could have said yes, or they could have said something in between. Okay. So on this task, as we somewhat expected, since the V-ing adjuncts were all fairly backgrounded, we see less of an interaction. I mean, less strong of an interaction, but the interaction did add value to the model. So, okay, so I'm going to explain one more measure of backgroundedness that I'm excited about, and this is work that's not described in the CogSci paper, but it's from Nicole's poster yesterday, and it's very much in the same spirit. So in this task, we decided we were taking advantage of the idea that if something's backgrounded, then it's not presenting information very directly. Backgrounded constructions tend to express information less directly. So in this task, we simply asked people, which is the more direct and cooperative response? So we prompted people for a particular kind of information. So tell me how she made such a mess. And then we gave them two options. And we contrasted different kinds of adjuncts. So she made a mess while combining chemicals, perfectly possible sentence. And she made a mess by combining chemicals. We rated the acceptability of both responses and for all the items, and there was no difference between the items. So it didn't matter if they were temporal adjuncts or causal adjuncts. They were equally acceptable. And I'm just going to show you the data on adjuncts. So what Nicole did was actually test 11 different constructions, but one of those constructions compared adjunct types. So there were 80 participants who rated declaratives, 80 different participants who rated the questions, and 80 participants who answered that discourse question. And again, backgroundedness is going to be to the left. So, and you can see a very clear, striking correlation there. And this was, the model comparisons show the same effect, but in this case, we included a mixed model to directly to test for the effect of the interaction. And the same pattern scales up. It seems to apply to a range of different constructions. So the argument, again, is that grammatical constructions have functions. I think there's a growing recognition of this. Also, certain constructions express information that's more backgrounded in the discourse or less at issue than other constructions. WH questions in particular make an argument in the discourse at issue. And it's infelicitous to make an argument at once backgrounded and at issue. That's a weird choice for a speaker to make, to decide, I want to ask about this and I want to background it. So backgrounded constructions are not available for WH questions. In linguistic terminology, backgrounded constructions are islands. And this idea then predicts, so I want you to notice that the judgments on the negation task and on the response selection task involve no long distance dependencies at all. So the syntactic account wouldn't expect any difference in that case. There are no islands, there's no extraction or movement involved. Yet we find systematically gradient judgments on WH questions and not on the declaratives, both in the negation task in experiments 1 and 2 and in the direct response task in experiments 3. Whereas the syntax only account doesn't explain this systematic gradients nor the correlation with the discourse tasks. And clearly there's a lot more to do. Islands is this idea of constraints on combinations of constructions is a huge topic. So next steps involve testing other long distance dependency constructions other than WH questions. We want to test other constructions along the lines that Nicole Cuneo has started. We want to look at correlations in languages other than English. And we also want to see if varying the intonation patterns makes a difference. Okay, and so, again, I want to thank my collaborators, especially Savi Nambuddiripad, sorry, I'm terrible, and Nicole Cuneo, who's here in the audience. Thank you very much. So we don't have too much time for questions since it was a little slow getting started, but I'll take one question, then I'm going to switch to the virtual.
Hi, thanks for this very exciting talk. Yeah, I have a question about, so from the perspective of someone who might believe that there's a syntactic source for island constraints, could there be an argument that maybe so there is a correlation between backgroundedness of constituents and island status, but could there be like a common syntactic explanation? For example, like the single event interpretation might be coming from like the attachment side or the size of adjuncts that may not be reflected in the superficial string. Like you can have the same string, but then it could be ambiguous between like multiple attachment size, or maybe the way things are derived cyclically or late merge into the structure. And then that gave rise to more or less backgrounded interpretation of the constituent and also the island status at the same time. So I'm just wondering, what is your take on that, and what would be a response to that type of view?
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Well, so you would, in order to account for the responses in the negation task and the temporal overlap task that don't involve any WH work, doesn't involve any long distance dependency at all. In order to account for what people do in those tasks, you'd have to include some kind of syntactic features in those cases as well. And then you'd also have to do them in the WH, in the long distance dependency construction. So I would say Occam's razor would argue against that. Also, you'd have to account for the systematicity in the judgments, that I can't show you right now, but I don't think that it's just two boxes, that if higher and lower attachment or something like that would be enough. But Yeah, but thank you for asking. Yeah, I'm sure people will try it. I'm gonna stay tuned. Okay, so I didn't realize I was going to be chair. I only asked because no one was here. We'll have the next speaker queued up. Oh, you're here. Oh, thank God. Okay. Okay.